7 words. That's all it took. 7 words that shook the foundation of the entire global financial system. Not spoken by a villain. Not spoken by a rogue state. Spoken by the leader of a country that has been America's closest friend for over 100 years. And those 7 words changed everything. I have covered financial meltdowns. I have reported from the edge of currency collapses. I have watched markets spiral into panic in real time. But I have never, in my entire career, witnessed anything like what happened today. What began as a disagreement over energy policy turned into the most dangerous financial confrontation between 2 allied nations since World War II. And the most jaw-dropping part? Almost no one saw it coming. Except one man. One man who had been quietly preparing for this exact moment for weeks. Here is exactly what happened, because every single detail matters. At 3:12 in the afternoon, the White House released an executive order. The president had signed a directive imposing immediate financial restrictions on Canadian banks operating inside the United States. Not on Iran, not on North Korea, on Canada, America's largest trading partner, a NATO ally, a Five Eyes intelligence partner. The order froze all correspondent banking relationships between the 6 biggest Canadian banks and their American counterparts. Starting at midnight, those banks could no longer clear U.S. dollar transactions through American institutions. They could not settle trades. They could not process wire transfers. They were effectively cut off from the dollar system, the financial bloodstream of international commerce. The White House called it a necessary measure to protect American financial sovereignty. The administration claimed Canada had weaponized its energy policy against the United States. And they were confident, very confident. Their calculation was simple. Canada needs the dollar system more than the dollar system needs Canada. Cut off their banks, and Canada's prime minister would be on the phone within 48 hours, begging for a deal. It was a show of raw financial power. America controls the dollar. The dollar controls global trade. Therefore, America controls anyone who depends on global trade. The logic was clean. The strategy was bold. There was just one problem. They severely underestimated who they were dealing with. Mark Carney is not a career politician. He is not a lawyer who stumbled into economic policy. He is arguably the most qualified financial crisis manager currently leading any government on the planet. He ran the Bank of Canada through the 2008 global financial crisis. Under his leadership, Canada became the only G7 nation whose banking system required zero government bailout. Zero. Then he moved to London and ran the Bank of England through Brexit, managing currency shocks and market panic while keeping the entire British financial system stable. He spent years advising sovereign wealth funds and central banks across multiple continents. This man did not just study financial systems. He operated inside them at the highest level during the most volatile periods in modern history. When Washington decided to weaponize the dollar against Canada, they picked a fight with someone who knows exactly where every pressure point in that system is located. And at 5:08 in the evening, he walked up to a podium in Ottawa. He adjusted his glasses. He looked directly into the camera. And he said 7 words that will be studied in economics classrooms for the next 50 years. Canada will now sell its U.S. Treasury holdings. The room went silent. And then the entire world felt it. Canada holds approximately $319 billion in United States government securities. Carney just threatened to dump all of it onto the open market. In doing so, he pointed a weapon directly at the one thing America never expected an ally to touch: America's own debt. Let me explain what Carney actually announced, because the full response was not just about Treasury sales. It was a masterclass in financial strategy. Step 1. The Bank of Canada immediately activated emergency currency swap lines with 4 institutions: the European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, the Bank of England, and the People's Bank of China. These swap lines allow Canadian banks to continue clearing international transactions in euros, yen, British pounds, and Chinese yuan without needing a single U.S. dollar. With one announcement, Carney neutralized the primary weapon America had just fired. Canadian banks would not freeze. Canadian commerce would not stop. The United States had removed itself from the equation, and Canada had already built an alternate route around them. Step 2. The Canada Pension Plan Investment Board, which manages $570 billion in assets, was instructed to begin preparing for an orderly sale of all Canadian-held U.S. Treasury securities over the next 90 days. $319 billion, flowing out of U.S. government bonds into European debt, Japanese bonds, and gold. Carney explained exactly what this would mean. If $319 billion in Treasury securities hit the open market, U.S. borrowing costs rise. Interest rates go up. The U.S. dollar weakens. And every single country on earth that holds U.S. debt watches and asks themselves one question. If America did this to Canada, its closest ally, what would stop them from doing it to us? Then Carney revealed one more thing. He had already made phone calls that afternoon to the central bank governors of Japan, Europe, the United Kingdom, and China. All four expressed serious alarm at what the United States had done. All four agreed to activate emergency liquidity support for Canada. And all four indicated they would be reviewing their own U.S. dollar reserve allocations in light of the day's events. Canada was not standing alone. The international financial community was watching, and it was disturbed. This was not panic. This was not improvisation. This was a prepositioned, fully prepared response from a man who had seen this coming and spent weeks building the infrastructure to counter it. The markets reacted within 20 minutes. The U.S. dollar index dropped 3.1%, its largest single session fall in over a decade. The yield on the 10-year Treasury note spiked from 4.38% to 4.91%. The 30-year Treasury yield crossed 5.2%. For everyday Americans, those numbers are not abstract. Mortgage rates are projected to increase by a full percentage point within days if the selling begins. That translates to approximately $340 more per month on an average American mortgage. For families already stretched thin, that is not a statistic. That is the difference between keeping a home and losing one. U.S. bank stocks collapsed. Major financial institutions dropped between 8 and 11% in minutes. Gold surged $127 per ounce, hitting an all-time high as investors raced towards safety. The market's message was unmistakable. Carney's threat is credible, and the consequences of following through would be catastrophic for the United States. But here is what makes this crisis historically significant beyond just the market reaction. The executive order created an immediate humanitarian disaster on American soil. One of the affected Canadian banks operates branches across 15 U.S. states and holds approximately $380 billion in deposits from American customers. Starting at midnight, those customers, American citizens who did nothing wrong, cannot access their own money. They cannot pay their mortgage. They cannot withdraw cash. They cannot transfer funds. The FDIC issued a statement saying it is monitoring the situation. Legal experts say this is completely uncharted territory. No president has ever frozen the operations of a solvent, legally operating foreign bank inside the United States. Lawsuits are expected by morning. State attorneys general across the East Coast are already reviewing the legality of the order. And elected officials are furious because millions of their own constituents are collateral damage in a political dispute over Canadian energy policy. The political fallout has not even fully arrived yet, but it is coming. Now let's talk about what this means for the bigger picture. Because the truly dangerous element of today's events is not about Canada. It is about what Canada's response signals to every country on Earth. The U.S. dollar status as the global reserve currency rests on one foundational assumption, that the United States will not arbitrarily cut off nations that are following international rules. America has imposed financial sanctions before on Iran, on North Korea, on Russia after the invasion of Ukraine. But those were nations that violated international norms in documented, serious ways. Canada violated nothing. Canada simply declined to sign an energy agreement. And in response, America froze its banks. Tonight, central bank governors around the world are asking the question Carney predicted they would ask. According to sources at the Bank for International Settlements, at least 7 central banks have already requested emergency consultations about accelerating their shift away from U.S. dollar reserves. This matters enormously. The United States borrows $2 trillion every year. That borrowing depends on foreign demand for U.S. Treasury bonds. If that demand declines, even partially, interest rates rise, the deficit becomes more expensive to carry, and America's ability to exercise economic power shrinks permanently. Carney understands this mechanism better than almost anyone alive. He knows that the dollar's power is not backed by military force alone. It is backed by trust. The trust that America will not use the dollar as a weapon against countries that are playing by the rules. That trust was broken today, publicly, in front of the entire world. 3 scenarios are now possible. First, the White House reverses the order within 48 hours as legal challenges mount and millions of American voters in key states find themselves locked out of their bank accounts. Canada pauses the Treasury sales, but keeps the swap line network permanently. The damage is structural. The dollar's monopoly begins cracking quietly. Second, escalation continues. Canada sells $30 billion in Treasury bonds per week. Yields hit 5.5%. Mortgage rates cross 8.5%. The Federal Reserve is forced to buy the bonds Canada is selling, effectively printing money, and inflation surges again. Third, and most consequential, Canada's alternative clearing network becomes permanent infrastructure. Other resource-exporting nations observe what Canada built and start building their own versions. Within 18 months, the share of global trade settled in U.S. dollars drops measurably. The dollar does not collapse. It simply stops being the only option. And that shift, gradual, structural, and irreversible, becomes the defining financial consequence of one executive order signed on one afternoon. The dollar's dominance was never guaranteed forever. It was maintained by trust, by restraint, and by the understanding that America would not turn its financial system into a weapon against its own allies. That understanding ended today. And a central banker who became prime minister just showed the world exactly what happens next.